Today is March 13th, 2014, and my name is Marty Dick. I'm interviewing Dave Sutherland.
I'm a park interpretive naturalist with the City of Boulder's Open Space and Mountain Parks Department.
This interview is being recorded for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, and the interview is being filmed by Megan Bose. Dave, I'd like to know just where you were on the night of Wednesday, September the 11th, 2014.
It was 2013.
Excuse me.
That sounds like a police interrogation. I was at home listening to the rain. Boulder's kind of a semi-arid climate, and so when it rains, you know, that's kind of a special thing. It's not like living in the Pacific Northwest where people get sick of rain, and I really enjoy rainstorms. And so we had seen that coming up that week in September, I guess it was probably the 9th through the 14th of September or thereabouts, we were going to have like a whole week of rain, and I was like, oh goody, I like rain. It'll be a nice change. And so we had, you know, gentle rain continuing through Monday and Tuesday and through Wednesday. And I remember Wednesday night, probably around 11 o'clock, going to bed and listening to the rain pattering outside and saying, oh, I'm going to open the bedroom window so we can listen to the rain. I love the sound of hearing the rain come down outside because it's so special to have rain. And so I went to sleep with the soft pattering of rain outside, and I woke up in the middle of the night, like 2 a.m. or something like that. And it was just pouring rain outside, and I'm like, whoa, it's still raining. That doesn't ever happen. And then I went back to sleep and woke up again at 4 a.m. and it was still raining outside like a freight train. And I'm like, oh dear, this is not good. We are probably having an event. And you know, I live in a floodway, in the 100-year flood zone along Goose Creek in North Boulder. And so by that time I was starting to get a little bit concerned because I was hearing the rain come down, and I was thinking, well, you know, I've hated paying that flood insurance premium for the last 10 years. Maybe it's going to pay off this year. And it continued to rain, and I got up on Wednesday morning. It was still pouring rain outside, just coming down like crazy. And it continued to rain all day Wednesday, and we watched the Goose Creek fill up until it was just raging with water. And my daughter had been out of town and came back into town that night and was just petrified driving up Highway 93 in the rain. She said there were cars that had slid off the road and that they had huge snowplow trucks out in places where the water was flowing so deep over the river that they were, or rivers of water flowing over the highway, that they had snowplows positioned in the streams to try to break up the force of the water so that people could get through. And she said her drive back up Highway 93 from Golden was just white knuckle all the way because of all the water and the, you know, mudslides and things that she could see on the road. And driving rain, she said the rain was coming down so hard that she was blinded, you know, having even her windshield wipers going as fast as possible. And so she got into town, and her apartment's down near Boulder Creek, and we said, you know, that's right in the main floodplain of the creek. Why don't you come spend the night over at our house? So she drove over to our place kind of a roundabout way because streets were closed, and ended up coming down Iris Avenue to get to our house, which was a river, and she was just terrified when she got to our home. She was just petrified and shaking because the streets had been so bad. They'd been filled with water. There were emergency vehicles. There were stalled out cars, and you know, it was just a nightmare. So we got her safely put away, and it just continued to rain and rain and rain. Well, by Thursday morning, it was clear we were definitely having an event, and we had been instructed through the media that we were all supposed to shelter in place to be safe and leave the roads to the emergency vehicles, but she and I snuck out and we went downtown anyway just to see what it was looking like, and drove around a little bit to get an idea of what was happening. I remember going down to the park by the library, you know, where they have that little Peace Park, and all the benches of the Peace Park were practically submerged with just these benches sticking up out of the flowing water, and the little garden down there was underwater, and the Peace Park was underwater, and the we could see along the bridges, the footbridges that go across Boulder Creek, there was so much flotsam built up on top of them, old tree branches and leaves and heaps of garbage and stuff. We knew that overnight the water in the creek had been up much higher than those pedestrian bridges, but they all still seemed to be intact. And the rain didn't stop. And it continued to rain and rain and rain and rain. And by Thursday night, we were actually starting to become a little bit worried because Goose Creek was swollen. There was water coming down 19th Street, just like a river. I watched water on Edgewood Drive, where I live, coming up and up and up until we could barely see any of the pavement at all. And the water crept up my driveway and up into my flower garden, and kept getting closer and closer to the house. So we were pretty nervous that night. And the next morning, well, I'm thinking that a lot of the severe landslides, a lot of the severe flooding in town happened on Thursday night. Well, we were sheltering in place, trying to get some sleep while we're, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. And finally, Friday morning rolls around, and my daughter took my camera and went out to take some pictures on open space. She got some amazing pictures of a number of different places around the open space system before the rain had even stopped. It continued to rain on Friday. And she was just able, she came back with reports that just lifted my wig. Meanwhile, we were, online looking at the Daily Camera website and the Denver Post website, and they had these horrific helicopter views, showing what had happened up in Lyons and showing the damage that had happened in Longmont. I have a friend who lives in southern Longmont, kind of between the confluence of the St. Vrain River and Left Hand Creek. And she didn't have internet access, and she was under a mandatory evacuation order, but she couldn't get out because all the roads out of her neighborhood were closed. So she called me up and said, Dave, you've got internet. Can you help me try to find a road that I can use to get out? And we went through, everything was closed, and she ended up not being able to get out and follow the evacuation order. So she took her cat and a bunch of food and went up to the second floor of her house and crossed her fingers and waited. And in the end, she was okay. We kept watching the creek, and most of the water that went down Goose Creek seemed to do exactly what I think the city had expected. The city has, over the decades, invested a huge amount of money in turning our drainages into these beautiful greenways and bike paths, which, 99% of the time are just great places to go for a walk or to go ride your bike. I commute to work down the greenway system on my bike. But when the flood happened, it turned, they showed their real purpose, which was to be conduits to get the water out of town in a hurry. And so Goose Creek just did exactly what it was supposed to be. All that water was piling up, and it just whooshed right out of town down the greenways, and it was gone and became somebody else's problem downstream. But at least it wasn't flooding my house out. And even the houses across the street from me that backed up against Goose Creek didn't have any flood damage. So we were very thankful for the city's flood control efforts in creating those beautiful greenways for us. That just functioned beautifully. And I kept going down and checking into the crawl space of my house, and it was dry. We moved all of our stuff out of the crawl space just in case it flooded. But I was also watching water build up in my backyard, which is relatively flat. And it turns out that my relatively flat backyard actually drains the whole neighborhood. And you don't realize very subtle differences in topography until you have 18 inches of rain dumped on top of you in a week. And then all sorts of interesting patterns became clear. Typically in Boulder, we've got about maybe a foot of topsoil over a clay pan and very, very impermeable Pierre shale down underneath. So the capacity of the soil in Boulder to absorb a lot of water is pretty minimal. Pretty quickly, when we think of water table, we think that you drill down thousands of feet to get to the water table, but the water table was actually at +4 inches in my backyard. There was standing water in my backyard because by that time the soil is so saturated it was as permeable as concrete. And the water had nowhere to go, and so it just piled up in the flat of my backyard, and I had standing water there that had found a creek and was running out to the street. I had a creek in my backyard 15 feet from my foundation that I'd never known existed, and it was draining the whole neighborhood. So of course I was chewing my fingernails down to the quick and checking my crawl space every 5 minutes to make sure there was no water coming into it. But even by Saturday night, Sunday morning, I didn't have any water in my crawl space, and so I thought that we had dodged that bullet. Meanwhile, we were continuing to see pictures on the news and so on that indicated I think at one point they were talking about several hundred people missing. And at that point, I was just, looking at what had happened in Lyons, the pictures we were seeing, looking at, what I'd seen around town, looking at the pictures my daughter had taken and brought back on the camera. I was thinking to myself, well, we'll be lucky if we get off with as few as 100 people killed in this event. So I was very, very happy to see that the death toll was actually more like, I think, 10 people across the whole Front Range, when, you know, they had this huge list of missing people. Oh my gosh, Friday morning I had to take my wife to the airport. I had to get my wife out to Denver International Airport, and of course Thursday night was when I think pretty much all hell broke loose everywhere. So she had a flight to a family reunion that she didn't want to cancel, and so I packed her into the car and we looked on the internet and tried to see what roads were open, and we ended up taking this very zigzagging, circuitous route on back streets and back roads down Baseline Road through town, really right at what was probably the very worst of the flooding. And I remember coming along Baseline Road to the point where it crosses South Boulder Creek, kind of down by the Bobolink Trailhead, and looking into the Bobolink Trailhead, the parking lot was underwater, and we have these beautiful stone sort of stair steps built there to allow people access from the parking area down to the creek so that they can go to the creek. That was just a multi-tiered waterfall. Water was just gushing over there. The creek was all the way up to the road. Cars were driving through water way up past their hubcaps. And, you know, stalled cars everywhere and police, and we were able to kind of, I'm surprised they still have Baseline Road open, but we took advantage of that and got out and zigged and zagged our way all the way over to Interstate 25, and I was able to get her to the airport. But I told her I think I may be spending the night in Denver because I'm not sure I'll be able to get back in. So just as I was coming back up I-25 at the exit, that's when they closed I-25 northbound from that point and shut down all traffic northbound out of Denver up into Wyoming for flooding that had happened along the interstate farther up. And so I, you know, was able to zig and zag my way back to get home that afternoon, but it was a white knuckle ride to get her to the airport that day, and I got to see just amazing things, you know. The amount of water was just astonishing. And when looking at the trailhead at Bobolink, I started to think, you know, this is going on all over the open space system. Every place we've got a creek or a drainage in town, this scene is going to be repeated over and over and over again. We're going to have trailheads that are underwater. We're going to have trails that have turned into waterfalls. We're going to have, you know, I saw landslides. I saw places where the road had been washed out, places where roads were just simply closed down. And so I was starting to realize that we would be having just a huge cleanup process after this, and thinking about all the missing people, and just fearing for people's lives, you know, about being trapped in a current and washed away, or people having their houses collapse on them, which happened. Yeah. We had a man killed up in Jamestown when the mountainside slid down and destroyed his house, and he was killed. We had a couple of teenagers up on Linden Drive who were swept away by currents when they tried to get out of their car, and it was just awful thinking about those kinds of things happening all over town. Well, probably by Saturday I was figuring, I was at the same time, I'm a science geek. I love science. I spent my entire life studying the natural world, and so part of me was focused on the magnitude of the human dimension, and thinking about the human suffering, human tragedy, destruction of human property, destruction of infrastructure. But another part of me, the natural science geek part of me, was having all of these light bulbs of epiphany going off. And, you know, I started to realize all sorts of things about, say, natural landscapes that I had never realized before. So I was very excited thinking about flooding, thinking about landscapes and landslides. One of the epiphanies I had was that I'd always sort of imagined geology works a very, very slow, drop by drop, sort of an incremental process where, you know, a little grain of sand washes away, and then the next day another little grain of sand washes away, and over billions and billions of years we, you know, see the landscape take shape. And one of the epiphanies I had was that, in fact, that is a process that goes on, but the landscape is really shaped by these punctuated moments of stark geological terror when we have a big event like this. And hillsides come down, and creeks flood and rearrange themselves and find new creek beds for themselves, and we see very, very rapid landscape change just within a day or two, kablooey, and then it goes back to drop by drop by drop. So just the way evolutionary scientists talk about evolution proceeding through a punctuated equilibrium, I realized that landscapes and landforms are shaped through a punctuated process with maybe many, many years of sort of geological boredom and equilibrium, and then suddenly this moment of stark punctuated terror when things come loose. So that was a very exciting thing for me, and it really put a lot of geology into context for me. It made me understand these sorts of geological processes a lot better. And I remember thinking, I've got to start figuring out a way to start working this into my geology programs. We've got to have a way to get people out to see what the flood has done to the landscape. And then I started thinking about the ecosystems. And one of the things that's been sort of an epiphany over the years to me about ecosystems is that they thrive on disturbance events. Even though we typically, as humans, we're used to thinking on maybe a generational time frame, maybe in 20-year blocks or something. A lot of natural processes happen across much longer time scales that don't really come naturally to human thinking. So you're talking about cycles that may happen over a century or 2 centuries or 4 centuries. And these natural cycles do occur. It's just that when they come around, it's terrifying to the humans who happen to live in the generation in which they see it occur. And so examples of that are big forest fires, big wildfires, or the pine beetle epidemic up in the high country right now, up in Summit and Grand counties where so many pine trees are dying, or this flood. They're periodic, cyclical natural processes, and healthy ecosystems thrive on this sort of cyclical, reoccurring disturbance. It's what drives biodiversity. It's what creates opportunities for plants and animals that maybe are forced out as an ecosystem moves towards succession. It moves towards sort of a dominant, stable type, and then along comes some sort of a big disturbance like nature's reset button, and it just reshuffles the cards or yanks the blanket out from under everybody. And nature and all of the life forms there have to scramble to adapt, and so some of them, for some organisms, it's like getting a totally new hand of cards. And every time we have a disturbance, nature shuffles the deck, redeals the cards, and you may get a winning hand or you may get a really lousy losing hand. But the flood was nature reshuffling the cards, redealing the deck, and then we're going to have organisms that come out of it that view this as a golden opportunity because they thrive on the disturbance, whereas other organisms are going to be big-time losers because they may have had their habitat destroyed or washed away, or some of them may have drowned or lost their food source or their feeding ground or whatever, but it's a very complicated, natural, almost a mosaic of things happening out there that are going to benefit some species at the expenses of others. And so I was thinking about this while the rain was drumming on my roof and pounding down outside my window, and I was watching the creek come up in my street. And I was thinking, wow, this is really neat. Think of all the opportunities. I got a call from a coworker, one of the other education and outreach people here at Open Space and Mountain Parks called me up on Saturday, and she said, Dave, we really need to think about how we can get people out on the trails as soon as possible so we can start interpreting the effects of the flood and help people, come to terms with this. And I was like, yeah, I want to show them, this geology. I want to show them this ecosystem. And she said, we need to give people a chance to get out and grieve. And I was like, what? Whoa? Huh? Because I wasn't in that sort of a mind space. But Deb, in her brilliance, realized that a lot of people were going to have to be saying goodbye to favorite places that have been irrevocably changed as a result of what happened. Trails have been washed out, favorite places have been washed away, places like the Annu White Trail, which I've broken the news about the Annu White Trail to many people who are just crestfallen when they hear that, because it was such a favorite trail. It was a very shady little trail that went up a canyon. Even in the hottest days of July, you could always find a cool place up there where it felt like you were in a woodland, and it was beautiful. And of course, the flood coming down 4 Mile Canyon Creek scoured it out so badly that it washed the canyon, it scoured it down to bedrock, and there's no place for Boulder County Parks and Open Space to even rebuild the trail anymore. And so people are grieving for the Annu White Trail, and they're grieving for a lot of other places like that that have been irrevocably changed. And Deb was spot on when she said we have to address the grief. So Deb and I started brainstorming how we would do flood hikes, and then we brought it, after I was able to get out of my house and get back to work, in the couple of weeks after the flood, we started putting together an outline for how we were going to do this. And we felt it was really important to try to help people work through stages of grieving, to come to an acceptance at the end that that the effects of the flood on the land hadn't really been damage. One of my other epiphanies was I quit using the word damage to describe changes to the ecosystem. Yeah. I started using damage as a word only to refer to things that happen to human infrastructure, houses and irrigation diversion structures and bridges and things. But what happened to the ecosystem isn't damage. It's a natural change that's part of natural shuffling the deck. And so I said, I have got to find a way to communicate this to people because it will help them with their grieving, because it's very easy to go and look at a place where all the shrubs have been washed away and replaced by a huge flood-tumbled rock field and say, oh my God, I used to love this place and now it's ruined. But helping people realize, no, it's not ruined, it's just different, and it's going to benefit a different suite of plants and animals than it did in the past, but that doesn't mean it's ruined. It doesn't mean it's damaged. It doesn't mean that it has ceased to fulfill any sort of a viable ecological function. It's still there, and it's still doing something. It's just different. And being able to accept that change with grace is part of how one gets to the acceptance in the grieving process. But we also felt that it was important to give people an emotional chance to release the grief by sharing stories. And everybody who lived through this event has stories. It's not just the people you're interviewing, everybody. And so when we started leading these hikes, we would show people from a geological point of view what had happened. We'd tell stories about the night of the flood. We'd talk to them about how plants and animals were going to adapt and adjust, and talk to them about winners and losers. But we also tried to open it up for people to vent and share some of their stories. And it was really satisfying to me to see people, as we were walking with these guided groups going along the trail where all of this stuff had happened, talking to each other, or occasionally people would share stories with the whole group about something that had happened, or something that occurred to a friend, or that happened in a neighborhood, or something that they'd personally seen. And it was allowing everybody to have this kind of a community sharing that I think really furthered this grieving process of people coming to terms with the change, starting to see it in a very different light. One of the other things that we had to do early on was we had to assess the damage to the trails. So just within even a couple of days after the rain stopped, we had the open space staff divided into groups and fanned out over the entire open space and mountain park system, and walked and hiked on all of the trails with cameras and taking notes to try to assess what's happened out there, what's changed. And then came back and kind of all reported back in to say, we've hiked all the trails, this is what we've seen out there. And so the department's effort to try to sort of restore the trails, repair the trails, started by assessing the damage and then looking for the low-hanging fruit, which were trails that had suffered minimal or no damage at all that we'd be able to open up again quickly. We had closed the entire trail system down because we didn't know what was out there, we didn't know how dangerous it was, we didn't know if there were trees ready to come down that had had all the soil washed out from under their roots, or rocks the size of houses just waiting for a hiker to walk by underneath so it could come down on them and stuff. So we closed the whole trail system and then started opening it up piecemeal by starting with this low-hanging fruit. And so we had the trail crews going out and essentially putting on some Band-Aids on some of the trails that needed just a minimal amount of repair, like filling in some gullies, or at Chautauqua Meadow, a huge gully had developed right across the very start of the Chautauqua Trail. So our trail crew went out and put some big sheets of plywood up and made a temporary bridge that allowed people to continue hiking that trail so they didn't have to step 3 feet down into a gully and then climb out the other side. And so we started with those kinds of low-hanging fruit, then got a lot of the trail system open again, and then started working on the harder cases. And incrementally, bit by bit by bit, over the next weeks, we would start opening trails so that every few days we'd open another trail, and we were putting out on our webpage, this trail is now open, that trail is now open. And giving people a chance to get out and revisit some of the places that, everybody, I think, in town was just itching to get back out. Boulder's a very outdoor-focused town, and a lot of people here are, I'll risk saying, addicted to exercise. They love it. They maybe even physiologically need it. We had one person who was very angry that all of the roads up in the canyons leading up into the, into the mountains had all been closed down, and this person was very angry and said, basically, my life is coming off the rails because I need to be able to bike uphill. Which is an alien point of view to me, but for somebody who's accustomed to doing that and their body needs that rush of endorphins and hormonal chemicals they get from exercise, that person was going through withdrawals because all the roads were closed and they were flipping out. Likewise, we had people who wanted to go hiking on open space and mountain parks, and we'd close the trail system down. And so people were frustrated. They couldn't get their exercise fix. I think a lot of people wanted to go out and see what had happened to their favorite places. I think there's kind of a human response to disasters is we want to go see how bad it is for ourselves. We love disaster porn. And so there was kind of this sense of, we want to see it, we want to see the pictures, we want to go out there and see it ourselves. It's this almost kind of this gawking sort of a thing where people like to go and see it. And we were frustrating all of that by shutting the trails down. So you take that frustration of people not getting their exercise, not getting out to see their favorite places, and couple that with the fact that we had all the trails shut down and these people were going stir crazy in town, we had to cope with a lot of anger from the community. And anger is the first stage of, I think denial is the first stage of grief. Followed by anger. So if somebody's going through a grieving process, at first they deny it. No, it can't be. It couldn't have happened. Then when they realize, yeah, it did happen, then they move into an anger stage, and it's like, well, I'm so angry that this happened. And then they move to a bargaining phase where, like maybe it could get better. If I could do this, maybe it'll get better. Maybe this would make it better. Maybe it wouldn't hurt so much. And they try to find ways to mitigate the grief they're feeling, and ultimately they get around to an acceptance phase. But in those first few weeks after the flood, we were dealing with a lot of the first three phases of grief. And so one of the things I had to do was go and stand on the trails that were open at places where closed, damaged, dangerous trails branched off and went up into the mountains, and there were people who wanted to go hiking on them. And my job was to stand there in my uniform and my name tag and a smile on my face and saying, "Hi, I work for the Open Space Department, and we'd like to ask you not to go on this trail because it's dangerous and because we're concerned about resource damage. We don't want to, have anything happen to you. There are trees that could fall down on you. There are places where the trail's washed out and it's loose rocks. We don't want you going off the trail to try to get around and create even worse ecological problems as a result of going off the trail. So please don't." And so I ran into the first three phases of grieving pretty hard. I ran into a lot of denial. "No, it's not as bad as you're saying it." I ran into a lot of anger. "What do you mean I can't go up there and hike? I pay taxes, And I ran into a lot of bargaining. "Well, you can let me just go up the trail there a little way. I'll just go up there to that. I won't go any farther. I promise I won't get hurt. You can let me do it." And so it's this kind of anger phase, and I had to stay there and say, "I'm really sorry. If you go in there, I'll call a ranger and you might get ticketed." And so people were very upset with that. In some places we had put up barriers like wooden fencing with signs on it saying, "Please stay out, damaged trail, hazardous conditions," and we'd put up yellow police tape, "Police line, do not cross," as a not so subtle way of saying, "Please keep out of this area." And people were so angry about this that we had actually a sort of a small organized band of vandals formed in town, that they had a Facebook page where they would get together and go out and intentionally vandalize the trail blockages that we had put up. And at first it would, just be ripping the police tape down. But then they started taking our fences apart with sledgehammers and ultimately chainsaws. So we had, some of the barriers we had sawed up with chainsaws, or they would take pieces, smash it up with a sledgehammer, and then carry pieces of it away and throw them down hills to hide them. And so in a couple of cases I found pieces of our fence. I'm like, look down the hill and there's a piece of one of our fences down there. I'm like, how did that get down there? So I'd hike down the hill and take it back to the fence and try to wedge it back in where it was supposed to be. But there really was a concerted and semi-organized effort to try to vandalize the trail closures that we were doing. I think one of the other things that we dealt with that's sort of an interesting human psychology piece is that when bad things happen, a lot of people can't just sit still. I think they feel this overwhelming urge to need to do something. Well, I can't just sit here and take it. I got to do something. And so right from the very start, we just had an overwhelming outpouring of volunteer offers from the community. People were constantly calling us up and looking for ways they could volunteer to help rebuild the trail system and so on. And I think we had literally a couple thousand people want to volunteer. So this is this overwhelming outpouring of volunteerism because people they were just going nuts. They were going stir crazy, sitting at home, hearing about the damage, seeing the damage, being told they can't hike on their favorite trail, and saying, well, I've got to do something. I've got to find a constructive outlet for this energy. The trouble was, organizing a volunteer project to repair a trail isn't an easy task. There are a lot of steps that go into it. Among, probably the first step is just going out with trail professionals and assessing what happened and how to fix it best. And so we had to have our trail crew go out and look at some of these areas and determine what's the best way to fix this. Because the last thing we wanted to do was go in and put up, invest a lot of effort in slapping together a really hasty and slapdash and stupid trail repair when we could do it right. But doing it right takes longer because you have to figure out what that entails. So that was something that slowed us down. We also simply had to deal with how difficult it is to organize a volunteer project, because you need to have leaders, you need to have people from staff on hand to direct the work, you need to support the volunteers, there's a whole bunch of logistical stuff, you need to be able to get all your tools together, you need to make sure that the people that you have are safe using the tools. We couldn't just give everybody a shovel and a sandwich and tell them to go up there and fix something. And that's, I think, what people in the community were kind of unreasonably demanding is give me a shovel and a sandwich and let me go, I'll fix something. And it's like, no, it's not that easy. So we tried to put volunteer programs together as quickly as we could, while at the same time realizing that we had to come up with projects that actually did something. We didn't want to just give volunteers busy work or have them do something that then we'd have another volunteer come out the next day and undo, which was a joke we talked about, is just to try to ratchet down the anger a little bit. We'll have these guys come in and have them build something, and tomorrow we'll have another volunteer group come in and take it down again. But we didn't really do that, but it certainly was a joke we talked about as a result of people who wanted to help us so badly that they got angry at us when we couldn't put them to work immediately. As a result, there was some real nastiness going on in the press, and some nasty letters to the editor, and some nasty letters to the open space department from people saying, I volunteered 3 weeks ago and you still haven't put me to work and I still can't hike on my favorite trail. In which case, we just tried to respond that, we're doing the best we can. We're dealing with we're dealing with an issue of such magnitude that we haven't even fully assessed it yet, let alone figured out how we're going to solve every one of these problems, let alone figured out how is the best way that we can mobilize volunteers to do this work, so that we're really utilizing the volunteers respectfully to do something that needs to be done and to do it right. And here we are, I think, 6 months out from the flood now, exactly. And we still have a couple of trails that were so badly damaged by the flooding that they're not open yet. The Royal Arch Trail, the Saddle Rock Trail, and the Chapman Drive Trail are the three that come to mind that simply have been so badly damaged that we can't open them yet, and it's going to take very significant amount of planning and work to reopen those three trails. My guess is, and my hope, in a lot of cases they're trails that were designed a long time ago, maybe way back in the 1910s or teens or 20s or something, and they were designed by people who didn't know that much about trail building. They were designed with a good heart but not a lot of knowledge. Frequently they're put in very bad locations or not built in sustainable ways, and they certainly weren't built to sustain the kind of usage that we get on open space and mountain parks nowadays, which is about 5.3 million visits a year, which is a staggering number of people. That's a human chain, hand to hand, that stretches from Boulder to Paris. That's our annual visitation. Is much more than Yellowstone National Park gets, and people always talk about Yellowstone being the most over-visited national park in the system, and we get significantly more visitation than Yellowstone does, packed onto our little 45,000 acre open space system and our 150 miles plus or minus of trails. So we're talking about an enormously heavy visitor impact on these very badly designed trails that in some cases go straight up muddy hillsides and things. So one of the silver linings for me in the flood is it may give us a chance to revisit some of those trails and say, we're just going to close some of this down and rebuild it from scratch, put in sustainably well-built trails using modern trail building techniques. And lo and behold, in places where we've done that in the past, those new modern trails survived the flood. They did great. We didn't see very much damage to the well-built, modern constructed trails. Because of the way that we build trails now. It's so different than the way that they built trails 100 years ago. And a lot of the damage that we saw were trails that were built 100 years ago and were never made to take these kinds of events or factors into consideration. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to go in and do that, to actually rethink some of these trails and reroute them in ways that make a lot more sense, given the fact that we may have another flood like this, who knows when, or that we're going to have these enormous visitor impacts on the trails. As it stands, though, I think we're going to really have our work cut out for us for the rest of 2014. A lot of what I did say that we've opened by this point, 6 months after the flood, I think I said we've opened 98% of our trail system by now. And a lot of those trails are not opened in what I would call a long-term, sustainable, permanent way. They're sort of taped together with duct tape and baling wire so that people can continue to use the trails, but they're not sustainable, permanent fixes. So in some places we've built sort of little detours around big gullies, or in a couple of places we've had dikes between ponds wash out, and we've just come in with earth-moving machinery and dumped a bunch of fill dirt in there to create ramps that people can walk down into the this newly scoured the newly scoured creek basin and then walk back up the other side, but it's not a permanent fix. So I don't know how long it's going to take to get our system completely back to some sort of a sustainable, I guess, easy to maintain system, but I'm guessing that we're going to be dealing with that for several years at least. And of course that's going to be expensive if we're going to do it right. And since I'm not a trails person, I can't really speak to what all that's going to entail, but some of the damage that I've seen out there on our trail system just beggars description and does not lend itself to an easy, cheap, quick fix if we're going to do it right. So there's going to be a huge effort. We'll be able to put volunteers to work. I think the junior rangers this summer will have a lot of work to do. Our trail crew will have a lot of work to do. But it's interesting to think of it as an opportunity to go back and do it right.
How much of this were you attempting to educate the public about?
Oh, all of it. That's something that we covered on all of the flood hikes that we were doing. I would talk to people on the flood hikes and say, we really want you to volunteer, but we want you to be patient with us because we may not be able to put you to work immediately. And in addition to that, the flood happened in the fall. And then that led us into the winter and the spring, where we have to deal with all of the weather that goes on in the winter and the spring, freezing and thawing and windstorms and snowstorms and saturated soils and spring runoff, which, we still haven't come up on spring runoff, but we've had a huge amount of snow up in the high season, so everybody's crossing their fingers about what the spring's going to be like when all the water starts coming down out of the high country. And so I kept asking people to be patient with us. If you want to volunteer, we would love to have you. But when we're really going to need you is in the spring, because the winter is going to bring a whole bunch of extra rocks down, and it's going to blow over more trees, and there's going to be more, in essence, the big part of the flood's over, but they're sort of like aftershocks from all of the geological disturbance that's happened. So we'll be dealing with the aftershocks of the flood probably, all spring, as things continue to come loose or work their way down or fall over or wash away. And we'll really need volunteers in the spring, and so my hope was that people would remember when spring rolled around that we still need help. Because typically humans move on from, whatever's the crisis du jour, they move on to the next crisis du jour, and the old crisis is forgotten about. And we are still going to continue to need a lot of volunteer help. We also really tried to talk about the reasons that we were closing the trails down. I ran into, as I mentioned, that I ran into a lot of hostility on the trails, and one of the things that was a very common thing I heard was, well, I've lived in Boulder for 30 years, and I've climbed Mount Everest 15 times, and I've climbed Long's Peak in the dark in the middle of winter, and so I'm not going to get hurt. You don't need to keep me out. I think that closing the trail system may have offended a lot of people's macho. It is a sense of, you don't trust me to be able to hike this trail anymore? What do you mean? I'm a very experienced mountaineer, I'm not going to die. And a lot of people we have in Boulder are totally capable of doing that. Those weren't the people I was worried about. We did have injuries in open space and mountain parks. Right after the rains had stopped, we had some jerk who was going up towards Royal Arch over rock fields in a closed area, and he broke his ankle. So in order to get this jerk out of there, we had to divert rescue crews who were trying to get people out of lions. Rescue crews who were doing legitimate rescue operations to go in and find this fool and drag him out. And so somebody who was in real need wasn't being rescued so that we could get out this guy who just thought that he was better than all of these please stay out danger signs. And where I was more concerned about was people like that who didn't know how to hike, but would see the guy who's climbed Everest 15 times going up the closed trail. So he's like, hey, I can do that too. And then they're in their, you know, rubber flip-flop sandals and they go up the trail, and then they're the ones that get hurt, or the tree falls on, or the rock comes down on, or who slide off into the mud and break their leg. So, you know, I think there was a real thought of, we have to keep people out of here, in part just so we're not diverting resources to have to rescue them. And then, of course, another thing that people sort of downplayed, but to me is a very real concern, is resource damage. I've gone on talking about how the effects of the flood are a natural process. It's natural for flooding to create erosion and wash mountainsides down, and scour out creeks and so on. But 5.3 million visits a year is not something that nature is really built to recover from as easily. And so one of our ongoing struggles has been people who go for a hike and find that the trees come down on the trail, and then instead of saying, oh, well, I shouldn't go out of the trail, I'll just say, I'll just walk around the tree. And the next thing you know, we've got a great big muddy path around the tree. Everybody's saying, oh, this must be the new trail. And then they start, you know, trampling the vegetation and creating a brand new trail for themselves because there's a tree in the old one. And so part of our thinking in closing some of the trail system was, we don't want that to happen. We don't want these sort of social trails to just start springing up every place somebody finds something inconvenient. There's a rock in the old trail, so we're going to make a new trail. Another concern we have too is that where a lot of the drainages have washed down and all the shrubs and trees that used to be in the drainage washed away, now it's like this long rock fall. It's a very, very tempting place for people to hike. It's sort of like this new highway that goes up into parts of the open space system that they've never really been able to get to easily before. Mm-hmm. And yet those are ecosystems that need a breather. They've been heavily impacted and heavily changed. Those ecosystems are going to need a chance to heal and recover and start, you know, fulfilling nature's natural rejuvenation process. But having, you know, crowds of people going up these drainages to just, you know, to go checking it out, looky-loos who have to go up there to see what happened, is not going to help the ecosystem come back. If they step on little plants trying to grow back up in these stream beds, or if they chase bears away from impacted feeding areas, or, you know, shrub nesting birds that are going to be coming back to nest in these shrubby drainages, and they're going to come back in the next month or two and find that the shrubby drainages have been scoured out and the nesting areas are gone. And those animals and the little plants that are going to be trying to going back are going to need a little bit of space. And so we're going to be asking people voluntarily not to hike up those drainages, but again, I don't know what kind of a reaction we're going to get from the public. If we go to people and say, please don't, because the bears and the shrub nesting birds need your help, please stay out of this drainage, are they going to come and chainsaw our barriers up again? Can we put signs up and just have them torn down, or will people be more receptive to the message this time around? I can't say.
Can people comprehend the time span that recovery is going to take?
I don't think people do real well thinking over long periods of time. I do think humans think generationally. I think we think in, you know, as far ahead as a few years to maybe a decade or two. But the recovery that we're talking about may take decades, literally. Just like the pine beetle epidemic up in the high country, I see that as a completely natural phenomenon that's behaving just exactly how it's supposed to. And yet it's very upsetting to people to think that the lodgepole pines that are dying aren't going to look like this again for maybe another century to a century and a half. Sure, nature will reset itself, but not in my lifetime. And meanwhile, I bought this mountain property because of all the pretty forests, and now all the pretty forests are dead. And so helping people wrap their brain around the idea that, sure, the lodgepole pine forest is dead, but it could be replaced with aspens or with a meadow or with something else that's equally interesting, and that you have an opportunity to watch this natural process. In your lifetime, you've got a ringside seat to watch nature do its thing, but it's going to take years. And I think that's a very hard thing for people to accept or adapt to, you know, especially if they bought that house because of the pretty views with the pine trees, and the pine trees are dead. And it doesn't seem to help very much to say, well, within 10 or 15 years, this will be an aspen grove, because those people may not plan to be living there in 10 or 15 years. Likewise, here, I think people look at some of what's happened, they look at it and they see devastation instead of natural change. They see ugliness instead of nature's wheel just doing its regular cycle. And it's going to be many, many years before it ever looks like it used to, if it ever does. Some of these changes may be permanent. we may never see some of the ecosystems go back to what they were like beforehand. And that's a difficult thing for people to swallow or to get used to. It's part of the grieving. It's very upsetting. Mm-hmm. Part of my role as a park interpreter is to help them make that realization and understand that change is inevitable and it's not necessarily bad. It just is, and it's different, but different isn't necessarily bad. It's just a different hand dealt to all of the different players in the natural system.
I'm impressed. I was impressed when I attended, I think, your first or second hike into what had been the McClintock Trail area. And I was a looky-loo in that I went because I wanted to know what happened to that trail because I know it well. Mm-hmm.
I'm not criticizing looky-loos. I snuck out of my house when I was supposed to be sheltering in place, and and went downtown. I was a looky-loo too. It's a very natural human impulse.
But I particularly chose to go with you because I figured that this was going to be not just looky-loo. This was going to be information, and I wanted information. And you presented that well, in addition to informing people who were climbing up a rocky downfall with their children in their flip-flops, that they weren't supposed to be there and that you really meant that.
You saw what I mean about how dangerous it could have been for people who weren't prepared. And I remember that hike. Those people were walking along a closed sections of trail where we had seen all these lateral lines. Parts of the trail had already slumped and fallen down into the creek basin. And they were walking right on the section where we'd seen cracks along the trail that indicate that more of that trail could go at any time. And that's where they were with their kids and their flip-flops. And it's like, no, don't be there. That, what is it about that huge keep out sign, danger, that doesn't apply to you? Why do you somehow think that you're not going to get hurt? Mm-hmm. I remember another interesting story. It was a couple weeks after the flood. I went out with a crew from one of the Denver television stations to show them some of the damage, and we had taken them up to that spot, the place where what we're now calling Bluebell Creek had come down and
Bluebell Creek, okay.
and ripped all those boulders loose, and it had thrown boulders around that were the size of refrigerators. Mm-hmm. And looking at the high water mark along some of the places along that little drainage, it looked like the water had been at least 15 feet deep at some point there. And so thinking about the power, how much water does it take to move a rock the size of a refrigerator or a small car? Mm-hmm. It is a huge amount of power, and it had torn this one drainage completely open. It used to be this sort of a little green, lush shrub thicket. Yeah. And all the shrubs were gone, yeah. The trail was gone, the little footbridge was gone. It was probably smashed into a million pieces, spread all down the drainage. Mm-hmm. And so here's this place where the trail had used to cross through this little thicket, and now it looked like this massive rock slide with water still running down through it. And there was a second drainage that came in, that came down from the first and second Flatiron that we hadn't even really known was a drainage. It was a shrub thicket. We didn't even know that there was water there. And sure, there was kind of a little depression in the topography, but now it's 30 feet wide, scoured channel filled with rocks and torn soil and tree roots sticking out, and it's just horrific. And so I'm up here with the Channel 9 guys, and they're taking pictures of it all. And one of the TV reporters points to the drainage and go, "What's that? So what do you guys call that creek?" I just looked at him and I said, we didn't even know that was a creek. It doesn't have a name yet. I suggested Sutherland Creek. I don't know if that'll stick, but if I say it enough times, maybe it'll become part of our local landscape. But the other creek, we'd sort of called it Bluebell Creek or the McClintock Drainage or something, but now we're definitely calling it Bluebell Creek because it doesn't look like a shrub thicket anymore. It looks like a huge ravine filled with rocks and, running water. I was just amazed at how long the creeks kept water in them because there's so much rain had fallen, the soil was saturated, it acted like a gigantic sponge that just held on to that water for a long time. Months, and literally a few months out when we would have expected those creeks to be dry in the wintertime, they still had water running, and it was a result of all of this stored groundwater that had saturated the soil and was still trickling out drop by drop by drop across a whole watershed, keeping water in creeks at much higher levels than we would have expected to see, say, in December.
How about, say, in March?
Well, we're starting into our snowmelt now. I was just out at 4 Mile Canyon Creek yesterday, and it has a lot more water running in it than I would have expected. I can't say how much of that is still groundwater left over from the flood and how much of it was just snow melting off after the last snowstorm. But there's still a lot of water in the creek. And you know, what we saw there is that there were some houses that had been right smack in the path of the creek. And I'm sure a lot of people are talking about 20/20 hindsight now, but we've looked at aerial photographs of the 4 Mile Canyon Creek area, and you can see in the aerial photographs where the existing creek bed had been before the flood. But topographically, you can see all of these other old creek meanders all over for several hundred feet on either side of the existing creek bed, where you know that at some point the creek used to flow there. I was out with a geology friend of mine who he was a geologist, and he said, when humans think of a creek, he said, we think of it as where the water happens to be right now. But when a creek thinks of itself, it thinks of itself as the whole potential of where it has been and could be. It thinks of its whole floodplain. And that's a disconnect that caused people to build their houses in the creek. They didn't realize they were building it in the creek because the water was over there, but from the creek's point of view, they were building it in the water. When right when you look at the map, you see all of these old meanders where the creek has changed its course, and you realize those houses are built right in an old meander. So lo and behold, we had the big flood in September, and those houses got flooded out. And all I could do was shake my head afterwards and say, what were you thinking?
Or what didn't they know?
What didn't they know? The same thing happened with landslides. There were a number of houses that were built just in the crosshairs under a gully. And in 20/20 hindsight, I look at that gully and see that it just had a big landslide run down the middle of it. And that's how the gully formed. That's why it's there. It's periodic floods and landslides over the last umpity-ump thousand years have created this big gully here. And so it's no surprise that when we get another event, that gully cuts loose and has another big slide. And yet people have built their houses right in the shooting gallery at the bottom of that gully. And I just look at that and go, you know, that gully's there because it keeps sliding, and you just built your house right there. And we actually had some houses that were destroyed that way because the gully reactivated, there was another slide, and the house was built right at the mouth of the gully, and it got taken out. So, you know, I guess I'm saying this to any future planners who might listen to this tape. Think very carefully about where you locate your house and buildings and infrastructure, because you may be putting it in the path of a fire or the path of a landslide or the path of a flood without realizing it. But the landscape has clues all over the place that if you read them carefully, you will see, whoops, bad idea to put my house over there. Shooting gallery. They had at that area they had put they're trying to put the creek back into its old bed, because the creek, of course, now flows in a new place right through somebody's backyard, and it took out all their landscaping and some trees, and and so on their private property they're trying to drag the creek out of its current bed and back into its old bed so that they can have their backyard back again. I'm curious to see how that works out for them. We will have another flood, and creeks are, like the 800-pound gorilla. They do what they want to do, and if the creek flows back over there, it could take the guy's house out again another time. But they are preparing to put the creek back in the old creek bed, and that's a discussion that's going on all over the Front Range right now, because over the last 100 years we've built our infrastructure with based on assumptions of where the water is going to be. It's that idea that humans think of the creek as being where the water is now. And so we've built our irrigation diversion structures and our bridges and our houses and set up our property lines and our highways and things based on where the water was before the flood. And so now the $24,000 question is, should we try to drag the creek back into its old bed, which may not be sustainable in the long term? In some cases, the creek was already flowing in an artificial bed so that people could build things in the old creek bed. Or should we just let the creek alone and let it do what it wants to do, essentially, and just readjust our infrastructure? And that's a difficult question that doesn't have an easy answer. I'm certainly not supplying an answer to it. I think it's going to have to be thought of in a case-by-case basis. I know that on the open space system, I hope that we, as much as possible, leave the creeks just the way that they are right now and don't try to monkey around with them, because kind of my experience from looking at history is that when human beings think they can do a better job being nature than Mother Nature, it typically doesn't work out so well for us. So I hope that we pretty much leave the stream beds that have been scoured, leave them alone and let them take care of themselves. But I also understand that in areas where there are a lot of people living or there's a lot of infrastructure, we have to be sensitive to people wanting to try to drag the creek back under the bridge instead of having the creek flow, over the road. So that's a difficult decision. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. I expect here in the Front Range we will probably spend the next decade recovering from this event.
And as you point out, people who experienced the event will have that in their mind the rest of their lives.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was leading a hike just the other day where some of the people who were on the hike had actually been away from Boulder at the time that the flood happened, and they were kind of sorry they missed it. Mm-hmm. It was a big formative event for our community, and there's nothing, I think, that builds community like shared suffering. When you and a group of people have to go through something really horrific together, it forms sort of a bond of brotherhood that lasts for a long time because you all survive together. And so that's an interesting thing to think about from, in terms of Boulder as a community, is that we shared this event together, and we shared the pain, and we shared the grief, and we shared the epiphanies, and we shared just the whole collective experience of what this flood was. And I think it's made us stronger as a community. I think there was a lot of people reaching out to help each other. I mean, I know I went and scrambled down into my neighbor's crawl space to help her fix her sump pump, and it was horrible, and it was muddy, and it was cold and dark, and I was down there with but of course I was willing to do that. And there were stories of people helping to sandbag their neighbors' houses, and there were people offering to put up other people who'd been displaced or had their houses damaged, or people helping, their neighbors move all of the wet stuff out of their basement, and so on. So it was an enormous community building event, as any of these kinds of events are. When we all pull together to realize something and to help each other recover, it builds community, and I think people who miss that are sorry about having missed it. I think most of the people who weren't here wish they could have been here to experience that.
And that, of course, assumes that it hadn't happened to them personally. They could help their neighbor, but they didn't really want to come home to find out that the creek was now running through their living room.
The Germans have a word that we really don't have in English, but it's a wonderful word. It's Schadenfreude, which means, I don't know the exact translation, but it basically refers to the kind of perverse joy you feel that something bad happened to somebody else and not to you. It's sort of that sense of relief that it didn't happen to you, and I think it's kind of at the basis of why we laugh at slapstick comedy when people get pies in the face and have bricks dropped on them and things. It didn't happen to me, and so it's funny. I'm not saying that I think people in Boulder thought it was funny what happened, but I do think it's a lot easier to appreciate the flood if you didn't suffer from it. I didn't lose my house. I had to pump out parts of my crawl space and replace my hot water heater. We had groundwater seepage in the crawl space, and I spent many hours on my hands and knees in the dark with a wet dry vac trying to clean up my crawl space. It was stressful at the time, but I got through it. And I saw people that had much, much worse happen to them, and so I felt actually very lucky that I was just dealing with a wet dry vac and not having to have my house completely rebuilt, or I didn't lose anybody. There were some people who lost loved ones in this event, and that's just the ultimate loss. I just think of the parents who lost those teenagers who died on Linden Avenue, and it just breaks my heart. But we all got through it, and we survived, and I think we're a stronger community as a result.